Now, some have said, and no doubt truly, that the popes were glad to divert the nobility. This is just the time that's leading up to the investiture controversy that we already talked about. And it might be that the popes thought it'd be nice to have an emperor or two out in the Far East, or for them, the Far East, as opposed to being here in Europe. But that doesn't seem to have been the principal motivation. There seems to have simply been this ideal. And they didn't initially call it Crusades. That was a word that was adopted later, maybe as much as a century or two later. But crusade captures the sense of it, because crusade was a French word that meant the way of the cross. They saw themselves sacrificing themselves, as Jesus had, taking up a cross, taking up self-denial to recapture the holy city for an eschatological purpose. And it doesn't seem primarily to have been getting even with the Muslims for having attacked Europe, although as late as 841, St. Peter's in Rome had been sacked by Muslims who had invaded from North Africa up through Sicily into Italy. So the Muslim presence had been real, but after all, 841 was hundreds of years earlier. And it's not primarily revenge. It's this ideal of doing something for Christ. And it is estimated that perhaps as many as 100,000 Europeans headed east from Europe in that first crusade to try to regain Jerusalem. And the amazing thing is, they succeeded. In the providence of God, the first crusade went forth at a moment of a great deal of internal dissent and weakness in the Muslim world. And the Crusaders were able to enter Jerusalem on July 15th, 1099. So the goal of the crusade was in this most remarkable way realized. And it seemed then a validation of the vision, of the expectation, of the hope. And the capturing of Jerusalem was a terrible thing. The Crusaders slaughtered people. The streets ran with blood. And the Muslim world has never really recovered from that vision of Christians slaughtering Muslims, but also slaughtering Jews and others in Jerusalem, other Christians in Jerusalem. Again, this mysterious energy giving vent to this horror there in the city. Now, of course, it seems to me, in the interest of historical fairness, even though no one is actually interested in historical fairness, that it ought to be observed that, after all, the Muslims had captured the city from the Christians in the 600s. But they had not been as vicious and as violent as the Christians were when the Christians recaptured the city. We have to recognize that. But to hold the Crusades purely against the Christians, as if the Muslims had never raised the sword in the proclamation of their faith, is a little bit inconsistent, it seems to me. And I have been tempted to say, although I'm too smart to say it, except to you, just amongst ourselves, that if they're really opposed to crusading, I suppose they ought to give Istanbul back to us, since they took it after the Crusades from the West were over. But reason never gets you anywhere in history. Now, the history of Jerusalem had been a very curious history. In the 2nd century, after the Jews had revolted again against Rome, Rome put down the Jewish rebellion and forced all Jews out of the city of Jerusalem and renamed the city, Aelia Capitolina, after a minor Roman goddess. And Jews were not permitted for a long time to live in Jerusalem. And only with the coming of Constantine was Jerusalem reconstituted as Jerusalem, so that he could build the Church of the Holy Sepulchre there, and it became then a predominantly Christian city until it fell in 638 to the Muslims. So Jerusalem had had quite a checkered history, and it had great varieties to it, and now it was in Crusader hands. And the Crusaders determined that one of the leading noblemen who had fought in the Crusade should be named King of Jerusalem. And that man's name was Godfrey de Bouillon, Uncle Godfrey, we call him in the family. He was actually from Belgium, and he was so pious that he said to be named King of Jerusalem was inappropriate for anyone except Jesus, and he wanted simply the title Baron of the Holy Sepulchre. So that Crusader kingdom was established in several areas of the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Crusaders held Jerusalem until 1187, so not quite 100 years. But in those days, it passed into Crusader hands and was the first sort of holy war that the Christians had fought. In 1187, the Muslims, who by that time had regrouped and re-strengthened themselves, were able to recapture the city. And, but the ideal in Europe did not go away. And there were some 5 major crusades in the Middle Ages to try to recapture the city. We can't go into all the details of all of them, but we might mention briefly the Third Crusade, which is probably the one that has inspired the imagination of the West the most. It had the most glittering leadership. It was launched right after the fall of the city of Jerusalem. It was launched in 1189 and went on for about some 3 years. It was led by the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa from the Holy Roman Empire, King Philip Augustus of France, and Richard the Lionhearted of England. So here are these 3 really prominent monarchs from Europe leading the crusade to try to recapture Jerusalem, opposed by Saladin, the noble Muslim leader in that part of the world. And it's in that context of the Third Crusade that some of our favorite stories as children have emerged, the story of Robin Hood. It's while King Richard was away at the crusade that wicked Prince John was on the throne, and that Robin Hood had to rob from the rich and give to the poor to try to defend the interests of the realm against Prince John and all of his failings. So that living sort of legend, there probably was a real Robin Hood, although not with all of the things we think we know about him today. But that living legend, you see, has cast such a long shadow. Almost 1,000 years later, we're still talking, still thinking of the drama, something of the romance of this Third Crusade and its effort to capture the Holy City. The Third Crusade was a failure. They failed to capture Jerusalem, and they had to return home in some disgrace, but not abandoning the crusading ideal. And only really a few years later, in 1200, a fourth crusade was being mounted, a fourth crusade that would sail from Venice and would attack with a mighty navy on the coast near Jerusalem and recapture the city. The Venetians perhaps did not fully share in this crusading zeal and seemed to have been in it more for the money. There was a lot of money to be made by shipping large armies to the east. And Venice not only saw money to be made, but also saw another political opportunity. Venice became aware that there was great confusion in the city of Constantinople, still the capital, 1200, of the Eastern Empire. There was a fight going on there over the succession to the throne. And Venice thought, well, maybe I can get some money from the emperor that we side with so that the emperor will cooperate with us, we'll make money, and the Crusaders can march through his territory down to Jerusalem. The Venetians thought they had a deal, and then the emperor, who was on the throne, a weak man, couldn't deliver, and the Crusaders were livid, and they sacked Constantinople the way they had sacked Jerusalem in the First Crusade, weakening Constantinople in a way that, in a sense, it never quite recovered from. And if you want to see the treasures of Constantinople today, the place to go is Venice. If you've ever been to Venice or ever seen the glorious San Marco's Church on the famous piazza there, the central piazza in Venice, and you look at that church and you see its splendors, rather Eastern-looking splendors, and you see pillars of stone decorating all the front of this church. Every one of those pillars was stolen from Constantinople. And when you see the great bronze horses, the 4 bronze horses on the balcony of San Marco, those were bronze horses that Constantine had taken from Rome to Constantinople, and then the Venetians stole in the 4th Crusade and brought back to Venice. And you can go into San Marco and see all sorts of gold and cloisonne and other jewels that were pirated from Constantinople to Venice in the 4th Crusade. It was a tragedy for Christendom, although maybe if those treasures had stayed in Byzantium, they would all have been lost. Who knows in the curious courses of history. But this sacking of Constantinople and then the establishment of what came to be known as the Latin Kingdom of Constantinople, it lasted for about 60 years. This was an offense that the Eastern Church has never forgiven the Western Church for, because there is still a Latin bishop of Constantinople, in addition to the Greek Orthodox bishop of Constantinople. And the competition between these competing clergies never was really overcome, never really reconciled. And as I say, the 4th Crusade greatly weakened Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire. The last crusade, we'll talk about the 5th Crusade, led by the Emperor Frederick, negotiated and actually recaptured Jerusalem through negotiation, which he was able to hold only for about 15 years. That was the last time the West was able to hold Jerusalem. But the ideal of the Crusades continued for centuries thereafter. There were still efforts to mount crusades in the 15th and the 16th century to recapture Jerusalem. It's a curious moment, a curious development in Western experience, and a major shift in attitude that it might be right to take the sword and shed blood to advance the Church of Christ. Not just Christian states, but the Church and the Christian cause. And it has left, I think, a very dark wound on Christianity in the mind of many, and especially, of course, in the mind of Muslims. They tend to see Christianity as every bit as much cultural and political as religious, because, of course, that's the way they understand their own religion. And so it is a battle of cultures for them, not just a battle of religions. And as battles of cultures, there's no real way to ultimate toleration in that battle. So the Crusades both illustrate and cause a lot of problems that we still face today.